Last June, I did a video on my first impressions on Film Ferrania P30 Alpha. Since then, they have dropped the alpha in the name, indicating a sort of graduation. Likely, they worked out a bunch of kinks from the initial run. For those who have never heard of it, Film Ferrania P30 is a cinematic black and white film with an ISO of just 80. I liked the film. I thought it gave a cool, dramatic result, but it wasn't perfect, so I was curious to see how the new version holds up. Hi everyone, Azriel Knight here, and in this video we'll take a look at the good and the bad of Film Ferrania's P30. If you didn't see my first video, I'll leave a link in the description. I highly recommend seeing it as I will be referring to it throughout this video. I'll also leave a link to an interview with the US director of Film Ferrania from my podcast. The new non-alpha P30 is just like its predecessor. When you get the exposure spot on, you'd swear it was 3D. But once you start under or overexposing, the image can be unusable. If you come across something you want to capture and you have the time, my recommendation is bracket. Make sure you're using a camera with an accurate meter and avoid super high contrast scenes unless you're willing to have super duper blacks and or blown out highlights. P30 looks great developed in pretty much anything. Here it is in RAW and all. Here it is in Kodak D76. And in X-Tall. While the look of this film gives a great feel for street photography, it's important to keep in mind you're not going to be able to freeze fleeting moments in the same way. At ISO 80, your shutter is going to be pretty slow, even on bright days, especially if you want depth of field. If your goal, however, is to capture motion blur, this does make it easier, especially on an overcast day. I have some minor gripes concerning its limitations in regards to exposure, but some of that can be corrected with user experience, shooting in ideal conditions, and playing with your developers. There are, however, a couple of things that I take issue with, and the first I'll mention here is just personal taste. I like a little curl in my film, like those slap bracelets from the 90s, so when I transfer from one hand to the other before loading it, it does most of the work itself. Not only that, but it keeps from unraveling and hitting my work table and collecting dust. If you have a device that pulls the film from the canister, you won't have an issue with this. If you rip open a film canister like me, P30 will want to spring loose like a can of snakes. I should say, though, this isn't the only film that does this, and it is manageable. Let's talk about something that isn't. In my first video, I complained about dust on my negatives that likely came from the factory, and I also talked about these halos with a speck in the center. First, I should mention this halo has come up on other films for me since, even when using other developers, which I initially thought solved the issue. I did a whole video on these differential drying marks, and it's now been updated with a blog post on how I got rid of them, at least for now. The long and the short of this is P30 could be more susceptible to differential drying marks, but these are not unique to this film. The black dust marks, however, are still here, and I found some on almost every roll. Sometimes they are big too. While this is something that can be easily fixed in Photoshop, it takes a lot more skill to remove in the darkroom. It's a skill that I lack, and even if I didn't, it's an added expense. I pre-wash all my film too, and they are really stuck on there. Another problem I had that only happened once, but is worth mentioning, is while I was shooting one day, I advanced at the end of the roll, and the film came loose from the canister. I could hear it and feel it happening in the camera, and the only way to get it out at that point was to go home and unload it in the dark. The film didn't rip from the canister, it unhooked from the base. Are these serious issues? I would say yes, depending on what you're shooting. It's important to note that Ferrania is a very small company compared to the film giants like Kodak and Ilford, and in order for them to grow, they need our support. and they need to be allowed the freedom to make these mistakes. You also need to be informed, and you should have a few contingencies in place when shooting the film. So here's my list of best practices. As of this video release date, P30 still has no DX code, though they will in the future. Until then, this film won't work on automatic cameras like electronic point-and-shoots, or the occasional SLR like the Nikon F55. To maximize tonal range and detail, avoid high contrast and backlit situations. To ensure proper exposure, when in doubt, bracket by one stop on either side. Take extra care when handling in the darkroom. Overcast days and scenes with texture and patterns are great P30 subjects. And I know this only happened to me once out of about 5 rolls, but if you're at all concerned about the film coming loose, and if you plan to shoot multiple rolls that day, consider bringing a changing bag and something to store the loose film in until you get home. I think if you're prepared, you'll have a great time shooting this film. This is a fantastic emulsion for dramatic and moody scenes, and though I didn't get a chance to do it, I think this would be an amazing film to play with in the studio, having more control with your light and subject. Film Ferrania has a lot in the works, and I'm curious to see what happens next. Just a quick note too, that because of everything going on right now, their factory is not operating. I actually put this review off for a month, debating whether or not this is the best time to release it. My recommendation is sign up to their newsletter and grab yourself a few rolls when they are back up. If you like what I do around here, please consider becoming my patron on Patreon. I offer things like early access, free prints, and more. Right now, I'm also holding a mail-in photo contest. Check out my latest submission. This thing is massive. You really took my no size limit to heart. Link in the description for details on that. And until next time, stay classic.